Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, we are going to be talking about how AMC will be making more money, why the shorts are on the verge of margin call, and how they've run out of money, and many more in this video. First, we're taking a look at this. We'll break 2 billion after the first day, should break 2.1 this weekend. So if you're going to be taking a look at how much money you'll be making, you obviously have to look at how the box office is doing. And what we're seeing is that the box office is doing very well. Now, I won't bore you guys with, of course, talking about how AMC will be making more money for box office. We should already know by now, and we should understand that AMC has made their operations extremely efficient. And so by looking at this, by looking at how the box office is improving, we know that that is the first step of them making money. But there's also other factors that come into play. What we can take a look at here is, firstly, Morgan Stanley now expect 4 straight cuts in 2025, obviously talking about interest rate. And one thing you have to realize in terms of how that relates with AMC is if this were to happen, it would save AMC around 4.5 million a quarter, directly improving both cash flows and earnings. And so we have to understand is that every time there's a rate cut, the payment that AMC has to do for their debt, for their interest payments, it obviously decreases. And with that, we are saving money. And so we could be looking at how AMC saves 4.5 million. And of course, with all that cash, they can do multiple things that will improve them, whether it's to pay off even more debt. And again, you can see how that will decrease the payment then and how that will generate them more money. You can also see how on paper, that will obviously make their fundamentals look even better than it already is. And furthermore, they can use this money to make more investments, whether it is to invest into their operations like we've seen them doing and how that's made them a better company, whether it's going to be into investments into other companies like HYMC, which is doing extremely well, and that's generating them income as well. You can see how this is going to allow AMC to be in a very good position. And the one thing we talked about is when AMC has put themselves in a fundamentally good position, it makes everything easier. It attracts capital, it decreases any possibilities of bankruptcy, it takes us one step closer towards the dividends, in which we talked about how that's going to damage the shorts. And so you can see how AMC is positioning themselves very, very well. And why we talked about AMC making more money is going to be good. And this is how we're going to be seeing how they'll be making more money. And now we're looking at how actually shorts, so whilst AMC is doing really well and going to be making more money, shorts are actually the very opposite right now. Firstly, reverse repo continues to plunges to new lows, now back to early 2021 levels. So if you take a look at the reverse repo, what we're looking at is for the reverse repo, we're looking at 17.331 billion. And you can see how this is a massive change than what we've seen in the past. And once again, like we've said, we are going to be continuously looking at the reverse repo going down. It is just inevitable. The cash they've used in the past before is not sustainable. Remember, it once peaked at $2 trillion. Now we're looking at $17 billion. And so whilst I say it's only $17 billion, it's because when you compare it to the $2 trillion it once was at, this is obviously a massive change. And this is why recently we've been seeing how short sellers have been struggling. We've been seeing how short sellers have been increasing the FUD, and even how some short sellers have flipped their positions into long on AMC and buying more AMC than ever, is because they realize that more and more money is disappearing. They won't have that easy access. They aren't able to suppress AMC like they did in the past, or at least it's going to increase in difficulties. And so that's why we're seeing them panic and really trying to flip their positions. And so when, like we said, when this reaches zero, it isn't going to be a matter of suddenly it's going to squeeze. But we've said that when it goes to zero, what we are going to be looking at is essentially a countdown, because when they don't have that access to liquidity anymore, they won't be able to get the easy money, whether it's to rehypothecate more shares, whether it's to create the swaps, whether it's to finance the existing positions. Everything that they've done in the past to suppress AMC, which required money, will now be at a higher difficulty because reverse repo is going to zero. And now I want to bear in mind and just kind of remind everyone is that, remember in the past we've seen this about GNS, which is obviously talking about the lawsuit on naked short selling. Now with the recent news, there hasn't been much attention, but I want to talk about why it's important and why this is showcasing that shorts are on the verge of margin call. The first thing is obviously the fact that they're running out of money. So therefore, there is, of course, that margin call because they don't have that capacity and therefore they're reaching their margin limit. But it's also because of things like this. Firstly, we just talked about GNS making a lawsuit on naked short selling. And something we've also covered in the past was how US court was ordering reviews of SEC rules on short selling and stock lending. So you can see how these two obviously go hand in hand. And then it also, stock lending, and we talked about is involvement with AMC and GME. But then you're looking at this, and this is right now. This is something that is, so this was recent, you can see August 25th, but this is right now, where we're seeing how CFTC is rapidly backtracking on guidance / proposed regulation. So what we're seeing them right now is they're realizing that what they've done in the past is extremely risky. What they're seeing right now is the exposure that these institutions are having. And so therefore they are having second thoughts on things like over leverage, things like clearing, which once again comes down to what we talked about, either with the short selling, with the stock lending, with the naked and short selling. And so that's what we're seeing with them doing this. And you can see why we've said that the short sellers are on the verge of margin calls, because all the things that they've done in the past are now being exposed. Their exposure of risk is at an extremely high threshold, and they are not able to hold it anymore. And it's why we're seeing all of a sudden, all of these regulations start to come together and start to really worry about these problems and why they're looking into it. And you're seeing recently more than ever how we're constantly seeing, whether it's changes to margin requirement, whether it's changes to risk exposure, whether it's changes to clearing, is because they realize that these short sellers have already made a huge mistake and they're trying desperately to cover it. Because you can also take a look at this. ICE Futures has charged Morgan Stanley with failing to report open interest in multiple instances between Feb 2024 and Feb of 2025, $25K to avoid a year's worth of margin calls. So what we're seeing is how they were fined $25,000. Now, bear in mind, this is $25,000 on Morgan Stanley. You would understand how much asset under management they have, obviously how much money they have, and they were only fined $25,000. Now, the main point isn't about the consequences. We've already talked about these regulations doesn't do anything with the consequences. $25,000 is nothing, and I've already made this example before. But if you were to give anyone an opportunity where you spend $25,000 and you're able to make tens, if not hundreds of millions, I'm sure anyone would take up that offer. Obviously, under the right circumstances, ethically, moral, and not what these big institutions are obviously doing, because they're screwing over other people. But another thing is it's just the very fact that they were going to be margin called. So we're seeing how massive institutions are already on the verge of margin calls. We've seen how they've positioned themselves and their risk exposure all to the point where if they're not doing things that are illegal, that are immoral, they will be margin called. And so that's what we are looking at. And so when we take a look back at what we just talked about with the guidance and the regulations, whether it's to talk about the review on the short selling, whether it's to talk about the lawsuit, it's all pointing to the fact that these institutions should have been margin called already. They have created positions that is way too big for themselves to be able to hold. But the only reason why they're still in this, why they're still able to hold on to these massive bombs that they've created, is because regulations have constantly been trying to help them and delaying everything. Now, one thing to note is that this is pretty much the same as 08, whereas obviously it's not the same instruments that's involved, but the same context still applies where regulations are turning a blind eye and they can delay it. But once it gets to a point where it's too big, everything will obviously blow up. And that's what we're looking at to be happening right now. And you can even see another example of swap. So breaking, there's been a change announced to the rules of the ETF GMEU. Before the switch, GMEU was required to keep 80% locked in swap agreements tied directly to GME. As of October 31st, it will just be 80% in financial instruments. And so what we're looking at is with these ETFs, how previously they were obviously using swap agreements. Now, we've talked about the things with swaps already. We talked about how easily these short sellers have created a swap positions that is way too big and that will blow up at any time. We've seen it with our kohrs, we've seen it with Credit Suisse. And so it isn't a surprise that right now they're changing. But another thing is talking about how we're seeing that they are potentially seeing these swap agreements to go to expirations, and how that's going to affect all of these other institutions as well. And just the very fact that they are finding difficulties in locating shares of GME. And so with all of this in mind, and we talked about with the liquidity issues as well, you can see why we've said that the shorts are on the verge of margin call and why we can see them blow up at any time. Now, as always, none of this financial advice, so do take what I say with a grain of salt. Make sure to do your own due diligence and research, and I'll catch you guys next time.